Hey, howdy. My name is Chad, joined by my co-hosts Victor here and the Bible artist himself, Kevin Keating. Thanks for tuning in and welcome back to the Bible Verse Project, where we're continuing to imagine creating a TV show based upon King David's time in the wilderness as leader of an outlaw band on the run from King Saul. And so tonight, in our creative journey here, we are going to kind of open up some questions about some adaptive challenges we might face from the source material in the Bible, especially questions related to certain cultural backgrounds and some theological questions tied up with those. So, Kevin?
Awesome. Thanks, Chad, for getting us started. So, we'll be tackling some really interesting and kind of tricky topics. So we'll be talking about things like David's polygamy and how we handle David having multiple wives, because from an adaptation standpoint, we're not really used to, in like our Western context, stories where there are multiple wives, and we'll have to think through how we portray that, or if we portray that. We'll be talking about the evil spirit or the destructive spirit that gets placed on Saul and how we kind of treat that whole situation. And there's also just kind of a military situation that we want to think through. Israel is fighting the Philistines, and in the Bible, we're basically just told that, but we may want to try to think through, why is that happening? What are the effects of that? What are some of the other kind of political situations and factions that are going on in Israel at this time? So lots of interesting things for us to dive into as we are trying to imagine what it would look like to take the biblical stories and imagine them into a more expansive adaptation along the lines of something like The Chosen, or just kind of a TV series that you're used to watching on streaming or on whatever your favorite channel is. So once again, this is a theoretical adaptation. So we're not actually at this point planning on making this movie. But, if you have a rich uncle who's got millions of dollars and wants to give us that money to make it, we would consider it. But we're doing this as kind of a creative exercise, and also as an exercise in digging deeper into scripture and just building community and friendship with one another and with whoever is watching. And with that in mind, also, please leave comments if you are here. We would love to include your ideas, answer your questions, take your suggestions, feedback, things like that. And just reach out if you are listening to this later on. And you can we'll try to incorporate those in a future discussion if you leave a comment or email later after the conversation is happening. And, if you're watching this on YouTube or on Twitch or whatever, like, subscribe, all that fun stuff, so that, more people can learn about what we're doing. And so we can kind of continue to be building a community around this project. So let's get into our first kind of challenging topic of the day, which is polygamy, which, it's interesting talking about this in our current cultural moment where there is kind of like this growing discussion of polyamory in like the secular world, but I don't think we're really going to touch on that too much. So talking as far as scripture goes, it's pretty clear in the Bible that David has multiple wives at the same time, even during this early period before he becomes king. So just to kind of lay out where things are going into our story, David's first wife is Michal, the daughter of Saul. He wins her over with the 100 foreskins of the Philistines that he kills for Saul. But then after Saul starts trying to kill David, David flees and he has to leave Michal behind. And he goes off with his band of warriors, and that's kind of where our story picks up. And you kind of assume that he's just kind of on his own during that period, solo. He can't go back to his wife because she's probably with her father, and it's dangerous for him to try to get to her. But then as the story goes along, towards probably the middle to later part of probably our first season, David will meet Abigail, and we're told kind of a story of how he meets her, and we'll get into that at some point. And he marries her eventually after her husband is killed. So he picks her up as a wife. We're also just kind of told in passing that he marries another woman. I should have written it down. I think, do either of you guys know off the top of your head, or you can maybe look it up on the side? It's something of Jezreel, like Ahinoam of Jezreel or something like that. So we get the sense that David is kind of starting to pick up wives, which back at the time, looking at from today, we think of gaining additional wives or additional women as kind of a sexual thing primarily, but most likely, culturally speaking, getting more wives was primarily a political move. So it was a way to secure alliances with different factions or different tribes. So when David is marrying into Saul's daughter, initially that's kind of cementing his connection to Saul until Saul kind of messes that up. He marries wives from kind of different sections of Israel or different tribes. And that's kind of because he's trying to build alliances with those different tribes. Chad, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say, I was paging through this Bible dictionary here. This is not going to be very clear, but you can kind of see David's, this right here, the family trees are messy. Like, they don't look like trees. They just look like, I don't know what kind of crazy plant it would be, but this line right here is all David's wives right here. So actually there's even just one that just says other wives, like just kind of combining them. So the one you were thinking of, I think, was Ahinoam. We're going to pronounce all these wrong, I'm sure, but that's Ahinoam of Jezreel. So are there really just kind of three that are named at this point? Is that what we think,
during
Kevin,
our section?
In our section?
I think during our section, before he becomes, king and stuff like that.
Yep. Okay.
I think the first thing we'd have to figure out is, this was normal for them. This is not scandalous for David.
Yeah.
So that's our first thing. It's like, however we present it, it would have to be presented as normal. Not using our point of view, because they would not be looking at it as like, oh my goodness, look how many. I mean, maybe they would. Maybe he had so many wives, but the fact that he had more than one would not be something that would have been, immediately scandalous to them like it would be for us today.
So that definitely is a question that we'll want to talk about. But actually, I think taking even a further step back would be the bigger picture question. So I'm guessing that we are going to want to depict the multiple wives, but there is an argument that you could, like, I think of like a lot of like children's book story or children's story Bibles and that kind of thing. They kind of skirt the issue. They don't mention the wives. They just kind of like color over it or whatever, or omit the stories that would require it. So we potentially could omit the wives, or we could kind of minimize them to the point where we don't really involve them in the story and they're not really significant enough for us to pay much attention.
Well, the way that we're doing it to where David's not the main character, that allows us to minimize it much more easily than if he was a main character.
So that's definitely a potential angle. Or we dramatize at least certain aspects of it and try to present kind of the significance of David having the multiple wives. Chad, what were you going to say?
What is it called when you make like composite characters? Is that right? Like you take from
composite?
Yeah. You take multiple real people, and then you just kind of, or this doesn't even have to be real people. It could be any story that you're adapting. You can just smush some characters together and kind of have them functioning in taking bits of them, or I guess when I was thinking of your question, I was thinking at first of it as like, oh, how do we deal with this embarrassment or something? And so like maybe we want to omit it. And I'm like, no, I don't want to omit it on those grounds. And I think that would be a mistake, right? Certainly we wouldn't want, I don't think that there is something to be embarrassed about. It's just a difficult thing to deal with. And especially as you're presenting a biblical story to a modern audience, it's just going to open up like lots of questions for people who aren't aware. But yeah, you bring up a good point that there are other reasons that you could omit them, and it might just be that's not where you want to put the storytelling focus on, is on these different relationships. And you can so one way of getting around that is you can cut characters or you can smush them together. I don't think we're going to add more wives, are we?
I doubt it.
That could be
Yeah,
fun.
so I suppose like what you're saying is, for example, we could potentially combine Ahinoam and Abigail, since we don't really have a story for Ahinoam, like she doesn't serve like a story purpose. We could potentially just tell the story of Abigail. We're still hitting on like the multiple wives things, because like we could make it clear that David is married to Michal, and we have a discussion there, but we don't necessarily need to get into all the different wives, just because that's not necessarily the focus of our story. So that is definitely an approach that we
I think you could easily present
reduce.
any of the other wives as political wives, more so than romantic wives.
Yeah,
it would be a lot easier just to have, oh, he's got 10 wives, like, oh, don't worry about it. 9 of those are just political convenience situations.
Yeah. So as you say that, I'm not sure if it will work to combine Abigail and Ahinoam, or whatever it is. We should make a shorter
wife
version
number
of
1, 2, and 3. Let's just number them.
Abigail, I'm gonna call her Honey, because Ahinoam, Honey, kind of I don't know, that's kind of lame. But so we actually have like a story for Abigail, and in that story she doesn't come across as like a totally political relationship. Like she has agency, she's admirable. Like he definitely appreciates her, not just as like a tool for alliance building. So it is possible that we at least reference, or like we could just briefly see that he also has another wife, to be able to convey this idea that David is kind of, maybe he did connect with Abigail, and since Michal, that marriage was effectively kind of annulled due to everything that Saul did, he might have thought of Abigail as like his actual romantic partner. But maybe he also has like this more pragmatic relationship with other women. So kind of the second question down here, which is kind of getting at this topic that we're discussing, is like, what kind of relationship does David have with each wife? So if we do keep all 3 wives, we can think through like, in theory, you could do romantic relationships with all of them, and David is just kind of a player. He's got just so much love that he's connecting with all the women. Or you could do some sort of combination of, which I think is what you're getting at, Victor, where maybe he has like kind of that one true love wife, but then he has most of his other wives are kind of more pragmatic relationships, connections that he's formed primarily in order to kind of advance his political aims. Chad, it looks like you were wanting to say something to that.
Actually, no, sorry. I was just thinking.
Okay.
I was thinking through what I know of some of these wives, and it looks like James has chimed in saying you can make a case for all of them being pragmatic, and I'm thinking like that might, I don't know, that might be, I think we might have this. We don't want to project onto like a biblical or ancient story our modern conventions and associations with marriage, and make it uber romantic, where that just, and yet at the same time I want to think that like they knew romance, like they they wrote love poetry, and they had feelings, and they could still primarily be pragmatic, to James's point, but that like it wouldn't, to dramatize one or more of these marriages, like it might be adding to the source material just on a technical level, but like in a way that would just be very human, like fleshing out these kind of relationships. So sorry, I don't remember where I was going with that, but I was trying to think about like which one of these would be, which one of these would be the romantic one. And I was kind of wondering, I was like, have we talked about Bathsheba cropping up earlier?
So that did come up, but the kind of the question or the concern that I have there is that we get the sense that when she crops up later on, so chronologically, this is at least like a decade or more from the Bathsheba incident. And so if she crops up now, it would be unlikely that she would go childless for all that period, like before like that point. I mean, I guess in theory it's possible that she's had other children with Uriah that we just aren't told about, but that would make it even kind of more difficult and yeah, which, you know, we're not gonna have to get into that point. At the very least, like, I think we have to be careful, like if we're imagining that she, depending on like what age we think she is at that point, we don't want her, like, I don't know, we don't want like David like checking out like
right
12-year-old
Bathsheba or something.
Well, I think also if we just like we're a step back from David and his romances and his wives, because we'll be spending most of our time with the men surrounding him. I think that's where we can have the romance in contrast with the relationships that he's just, you know, very political and, you know, he's doing his duty. He's got a wife that he cares about somewhere else that is not with us or not with him at the moment. I think that would allow us to have play both of those angles.
Yeah.
Especially since we're not going to be spending direct time with David as much as a main character. We don't need to see his romantic relationships as much as we do our other characters, I think.
I do think that one of the main kind of takeaways that we want for the audience is for people that are not super acquainted with the biblical world to understand after watching our show that the practice of taking multiple wives is not primarily like a let's get tons of sex partners, and you know, it's not that kind of a thing. Like, we really want to hammer home the point of the institution of polygamy at this time was alliance building. It was political, and so, and especially like you said, Victor, if David is not our primary point of view character, then we probably aren't going to be spending a lot of time with his kind of emotional state and his relationship building. We could hint at it in parts and bits. Like, I could see during the Abigail episode when, you know, he'll there's everything going on with Nabal and stuff like that. It might be interesting to have him kind of, one of the characters is talking to him and he's like longing for Michal, his old wife, and that kind of, we see him, you know, then he gets the opportunity to take another wife or something like that. So we can also show that he's also human and you know, like an emotional being, a sexual being too, while also kind of hammering home that pragmatic political aspect of marriage at the time.
Yeah, I think especially too, if all of the other characters only have one wife or girlfriend or whatever, then that would contrast, you know, they'd be like, you know, glad I'm not somebody like him that has to have more than one of these wives. You know, because it is something that they would be thankful not to have to do. And it's more of like he's got to, kind of, because he's the leader and that's kind of what's expected.
Yeah, and that is a good point also to hammer home to audiences that, like, polygamy was not the norm for the majority of people, because if you were like, you had to have a lot of money to be able to support multiple wives and multiple children and stuff like that. So that's another part of like the world building that we want to do. We want to help contrast someone like David, who's, you know, a high up leader, who's not only he's able to support multiple wives, and he also kind of needs them in order to kind of support his aspirations, compared to kind of the everyman who is neither able to, and he also doesn't have kind of a purpose for doing that.
I think with shows like Game of Thrones and stuff like Dune, audiences are more understanding of how political alliances and matches work, where I think it'd be easier to separate those kind of things. Oh, he's got to do this. He doesn't have a choice.
Yeah,
it'd be a lot easier to understand and accept.
Victor, kind of circling back to the question that you were posing earlier about kind of at the time, polygamy was fairly normal within the culture. And we especially as Christians, may look back at it, and we're not going to have positive views of that. And yeah, there is like a tension or a balance we have to think through, as far as I think there are kind of like a couple of like dangers. There's like the danger of being so kind of grounded in our own current time that we're not allowing viewers to kind of cross over and put themselves back in that time and that place and understand why, even if it wasn't a good thing, why this was like a common thing, and how it would have been easy to exercise polygamy if you were in the position of someone like David. So we do want to allow people to like transport themselves back into that time without feeling like we're constantly just judging. But at the same time, I do think that within the biblical stories, the way that they're constructed, we don't get like a lot of explicit condemnations of polygamy and multiple wives and stuff like that. But, you know, Deuteronomy does warn against kings multiplying their wives. And as far as how like the stories are structured in both the Torah and the later books, there's definitely like a caution, or we're being drawn to see that polygamy actually was not a good thing. Attempting to build alliances through marriage, it may be culturally acceptable, but it's not ultimately acceptable in God's eyes. And you know, as Jesus eventually points us to, you know, he reminds us that in Genesis, you know, God created, you know, one man, one woman, and that's God's ideal. So we do want to kind of balance between, if we do show kind of the multiple wives thing, we could kind of hint at the negative consequences of it, or like the slightly dubious nature of it, while at the same time not leaning so heavily into that we're kind of taking ourselves out.
One of the advantages of doing it as a TV show is you have time to explain the nuances of that, where
yes,
if it was a movie, you just don't have time to go into it. You just have to, you know, jettison all the other wives for the sake of just telling that story. But if we have enough time, we could explain it to where it makes sense in you know, their context and currently for us too.
One of the nice things about having one of the nice things about having the focus more on other characters is that, you know, David may not spell out his motivations like, here's why I'm taking these wives, but like a character in the background can ask, like, or not in the background, but like a character that's not David can ask another character, like, why is he taking, you know, these wives? Like, not that it would have to be that on the nose, but like there could be a conversation, I feel like, much more easily about David and his, you know, his wives to handle questions like these. And this could apply to other sticky questions too. You have characters literally just discussing it, much like we like basically asking the questions that we would ask. And
they can have differing viewpoints as far as how acceptable it is.
Yeah.
Like you have some people who are like, that's what every king does. You have other people be like, yeah, but you know, didn't Adam just have one wife? Or maybe that's like too on the nose, but you know, we can have someone like kind of question, you know, being the skeptic about the practice.
I mean, the Chosen's good about doing stuff like that too, taking a confusing cultural idea that's not common today and making it easy for us to understand why it was important back then. So it's easy to, not easy, but it's something that a TV show could more easily do.
Chad,
yeah, as far as thinking about your second question there, Kevin, I was trying to think which wife. I mean, basically, you have the Ahinoam, who's, you know, just kind of thrown in there, and that one would, you know, it doesn't make sense to really develop that character into like a romantic one. So we can assume it's pragmatic, I suppose. But between Michal and Abigail, do you have, I guess I'll just throw it out there before giving my impression. Which one would be, if you had to pick one to be the romantic interest and one to be more pragmatic, I suppose.
I think that with Abigail, given her story and like the way that we really see her character as admirable and as wise, I think David should at least, it can't be a totally calculating move, him taking her on as wife. Like, I think he should have like genuine appreciation for her, while at the same time there could be a little bit of, pragmatism there. So it doesn't have to be a total either or, but I definitely think that we should see there that he has like a genuine appreciation for her as a person.
I actually just, again, like kind of just running my eyes over the story. We do see him like laud her and heap praises upon her. And then he doesn't just say like, oh no, I'm going to marry you. He actually, it's only after Nabal dies that he's like, oh, okay. And then he asks, and that feels very different. Again, as far as how David and Michal come together, where the emphasis seems to be on David basically being concerned about, or like interested in, by the honor of being the king's son-in-law, Saul's son-in-law. And it says a number of times that Michal loved David, though then she also is kind of conflicted because of, things that she feels about David later. But that one would be, I don't know if that makes it pragmatic, but it's just not it doesn't strike me as the romantic, I guess. It seems kind of, it starts on a weird note, a really weird note with the whole foreskin thing.
And even going before that, back to the David and Goliath story, there's this point in the David and Goliath story where David keeps going around asking people what he'll get if he kills Goliath. And, one of the things that gets mentioned is that you'll be able to marry one of the king's daughters. So there's this sense that we get even early on in David's story that he's got some mixed motives. He's not completely pure in heart. Like he wants to defend God's honor and he has faith in God and all of that. But he is a little interested in being, the son-in-law of the king and getting some of those advantages. So I definitely see what you're saying there. And we're probably not going to be going all the way back to when David first met Michal, and we'll have to even see how much of like that actual relationship we get, if we want to do the scene where David's, hiding the household idol or he's pretending to have it be him or whatever. But at least that's a good point. Like, we're probably not going to have, I had before suggested that maybe David is pining for her, but we may actually have it so that he's not really all that concerned. Like, maybe he's not totally torn up over her. That's a good point. Cool. Well, do you guys have any other questions or thoughts on the polygamy situation?
Just one question, which is, there's the option to minimize or dramatize. It sounds like we're not. And I'm trying to think, is it like what does the show gain from focusing in on at different points or certain points, even if it's just David and Abigail, like how does that kind of contribute to the picture of David? I'm asking because I'm just not sure. I'm not doubting it. I just
I think it's just because it's part of the story that if you do any reading of the Bible, that'll be one of the first things you're like, oh, wait, hold on a second. He had how many wives? I think it's a point that a lot of like skeptics will jump on, is like, well, if God has all these rules, why is he allowing polygamy? Why is that something that's allowed back then? It's like, I think it'd be a way to just address that in a way that, just places it within the context of that world, what was normal for them, or at least what was acceptable for them at that time, where we're not just pretending like it doesn't exist.
I think you could still do that. I agree. To leave it out completely would cause some people to be kind of skeptical, like, oh, you're just avoiding the ugly parts, even if that's not the intention. Though I still think you could minimize it by basically not, you know, and it just gets alluded to. Well, and actually you can handle it with humor too, I think. Like another wife, seriously, like, and you know, you could still find clever ways to handle it that are supposed to be funny and acknowledge this feature of you know.
And that's how we handle it today. We read about that and we're like, who would want to have that many wives? I mean, that's the same thing we say. They'd be saying it too. That wouldn't be that would be the exact sort of conversations they'd be having.
Yeah, I think the
could
thing
be,
that I go for it, Chad.
Oh, I was gonna say there could be punchy, humorous ways to handle it without making it like its own big theme in the story. I guess I would only want, I guess I would want to go that route if it felt like this doesn't feel like an important storyline, other than the fact that it shows up in our source material and we have like an interest in, I don't know. So you can acknowledge it without depicting it, I guess is one way of putting it. And still, provide what feel like some of those necessary. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
So one way I kind of look at how we're doing this is like, in the same way that The Chosen is kind of showing that Jesus is like, he's got different rules that apply to him than regular people. It's kind of the same way with David. David is, you know, at this point, he knows he's going to be king eventually. He's been anointed already, right? At this point in the story, correct?
Yeah.
So, I mean, he knows that there are things that are going to be required of him that are going to be different than other people. And all the other people there too know that he is going to be this person. So I think that gives us an opportunity to point out those differences in a way that makes sense and be interesting to see in the show. Like, he's got to do this. He has to have these other wives. You know, he's going to be king. It's going to be expected of him, even if he doesn't want to. You know, he's going to have these wives. You know, that's just what kings do.
I definitely think that's a good like perspective that we'll want. So I guess what I'm thinking as we're talking about this is really what we're going to dramatize is less like the interior workings of the polygamous relationship of David, and more we're going to be dramatizing from the outside, like the other characters, how they perceive it, their conversations about it. And so it's more the story of its significance to those other characters. And what I do think is important, like one reason why I do think this is an important thing to pick up on or to include in our story, is I definitely do want to show how David is kind of pushed and pulled between kind of faith and trying to kind of trust in earthly means of seeking power. So building alliances through marriage would kind of fit into that that tension. You know, he could kind of just try to trust the Lord to give him power and to provide for him and stuff like that. But I think the decision to take multiple wives, I would see in a more negative light. But I think there's room to have characters have different perspectives on that. So some of them may think that, oh well, you know, he's king, he's in a special position. This is just like one of those areas where there's different rules for him compared to the rules for us.
Well, so even though there's different rules for him, right? So even though there's different rules for him, we know that this is the topic that is his big moral failing.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't matter how right he is or how justified he was in having multiple wives. This thought process is what led him to his ultimate downfall. So it's kind of baked into his whole, rise and fall and his failing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel like those are good reasons to, as opposed to just, injecting a love story, just to have one, or just because this is there as a feature of the text, but that it kind of intersects with a theme of kingship and like the kind of message that we want to draw out related to that gets teased out with kingship about trust and like what kind of king are you going to be, and then also, yeah, as you said, Victor, that we know that the Bathsheba thing's down the road, and if I remember right, that's more just like carnal, right? It's not pragmatic, right?
Yep.
So that's where that gives me, seems to me, that means that we can kind of remember that David is like a flesh and blood human being who has like his passions wrapped up in this, and those are passions for power and for sex, and arguably they kind of both come together, you know, with the whole Bathsheba incident and sin. So
except for being a king, that whole thing wouldn't have happened. I mean, he used all of his power as a king to both get her over to him and to get rid of Uriah. You know, that's him thinking, well, I'm a king, I'm allowed to have multiple wives, taking that to the worst extreme. You know, this is the path that he's on. So I think it would be okay to start showing that this is something maybe he either struggles with, or that this is his, you know, the thorn in his side, is like maybe he's that's kind of something he just thinks about too much.
And it's also something that the people around him struggle with, like deciding like to what degree are there different rules for him, to what degree you know, do we,
that's interesting,
are we on board with this, you know? So cool. Well, I think we've kind of hit that topic for a decent amount for at a kind of a big picture level, and then, you know, as we're going along and developing stories, you know, we'll have to think through this a little bit more like on a concrete level when it comes to the episode where we introduce Abigail and stuff there. But yeah, we can move on maybe to one of our other topics. So, supernatural elements in our story. So in particular, the book of Samuel, throughout this period of time, David is inquiring of God. So we'll want to talk about what exactly that means, to inquire of God. What were the Urim and Thummim, or at least how we may, you know, we don't, none of us has like some secret insight as Bible scholars. You know, we can't go back and improve one understanding or the other, but we'll at least want to talk about how we want to depict them, and then also on the bad guy side with Saul, how do we think of the evil spirit or the destructive spirit, because it may not necessarily be a morally evil spirit. It could be just a spirit that brings harm. So yeah, let's start with inquiring of God, and then we can go to Saul. So yeah, like I said, throughout this period of time and even later on during David's reign, we see David is said to inquire of God about different situations, and sometimes that is explicitly tied to the Urim and Thummim. Sometimes we're just told that David inquired of God, and we're not sure whether he just like prayed and God answered him, or whether the text is kind of giving us a general description of how David asked questions through the Urim and Thummim. A little bit of context with the Urim and Thummim. We don't really know for sure what these were. A lot of scholars think that they were some form of casting lots, like a sacred stone, maybe like a two-sided thing, or where like one side, if it came up, it showed that someone was guilty, and if the other side came up, it showed that they were innocent, or some sort of like dice like object. So that's one theory of what the Urim and Thummim were, is there some sort of like random chance kind of object that you could use to discover something, because, you know, when you throw a dice, God's kind of in control of it. You are giving up your control and waiting for God and his sovereignty to lead you to an answer. There's also like another theory that shows up. I think this shows up in Josephus or in like some of the rabbinical sources, where it actually talks about the Urim and Thummim either being a rock that emits light, or it being somehow like the breastplate of the high priest, that the different stones that were in it would emit light, either like in patterns or in shapes, or like depending on which stone lit up, it would like kind of do like a message based on that. Like certain stones would be associated with certain letters. So that's another theory of what the Urim and Thummim were. Or, we could also just depict it as David like praying to God and getting kind of a audible answer.
That would be my feeling, because it's just so hard to explain this to where it doesn't come across as weird. But my question about it is like, can we tell this story without having those elements in there? If so, I would say just make it as simple as like, well, David, prayed, or something like that, where he did something, he communed somehow with God, and especially if we're not making him the viewpoint character, unless somebody's there with him, we don't have to see what he actually did. But I just think that's the stuff that's like, I mean, it's just so much speculation. Like even what we know is like, you don't even know. It's like, how would we be able to depict that makes sense to a random viewer, much less a biblically, trained person.
So that definitely would be, so that kind of skips down to one of my questions, which is how much do we see? So we could kind of avoid the question of what exactly was entailed by inquiring of God by basically like never showing it directly. Like we see David, intent on getting an answer from God, and then he goes off and we don't see what he does, but he comes back with an answer. So that would be like one way to depict it, where, there's kind of some mystery, but we don't have to like figure out a specific mechanism and worry about, does it kind of look hokey to have these lights shining, like a strange kind of SOS signal? Or Chad, do you have any thoughts on it?
I can't remember if this is like a scene in Austin Powers or what it was, but it's like a kind of scene where it's like something is happening in the scene, but it's like getting covered up by different kind of objects consistently. Does that make sense?
That was the second one.
Things keep obfuscating, or just like getting in between like the viewer and the thing. And I don't know if that's in Austin Powers. There's some scene like that.
That was definitely Austin Powers.
And that could be like not that this is a humorous show necessarily, but insofar as there is humor, like that's always one of the options that you can use when appropriate, is like whenever it's being employed, like, or there's these lots that are being cast or whatever, or the Urim and again, I'm not going to be able to pronounce these two stones or whatever we think they might be. Whenever they're being cast by a character, like it could just always maddeningly be out of view or blocked somehow. And then, it just becomes a bit that it's like, oh, like I wanted to see it. Like I couldn't see it again, or I don't know how to make it funny or whatever. But, and it wouldn't have to obviously be as zany as Austin Powers, but if it only shows up a few times, and it's just, that could be one of those kind of winky nudges, like to the audience, for people who know that, like, yeah, this is in there. We don't know what it is. It's happening. We see the result, but like, so anyways, I just like to throw that out there.
That could be another one where, the characters can be debating on what they think it means. And like, like somebody that was there is like, well, I can't tell you. You're not one of the people that was invited into the room, so you just have to take our word for it. It was cool. Trust us.
So here's the only pushback that I'm going to have against like obfuscating or whatever. I think that we need to figure out some of the limitations of how this works. Otherwise, it's going to feel like shouldn't David like always be doing this, like for every single decision that he made? Like, I don't know. Like I think we have to think through.
I think you just avoid it, because otherwise it just comes across too much like magic. Like it feels like something that, like you said, it's like, why didn't you do this every single time? Like it asks more questions than you would answer by even explaining how it works or how we think it works.
So James is bringing up, there's one of the examples of things that David finds out through the Urim and Thummim. So there's the situation where the Philistines are attacking a city, Keilah, and first David asks, like, should I go help the city? And God says, go ahead, go help the city. And David helps the city, defeats the Philistines. But then the city, Saul hears that David's at the city. He's going with his army. And David's like, God, should I leave the city or should I stay? And he inquires from God, and God says, leave the city. The people are going to give you up into the hands of of Saul and his men. So there are definitely some stories during our period where this serves a definite function, and I don't know if we can totally give it up, because part of what the story is showing is that David is someone who he's seeking after God. He's seeking like God's input or God's guidance, as opposed to Saul, who is this person who isn't really concerned about seeking after God until like the very end, when it's too late, basically, and then he consults with a medium and all of that. So like, I think we have to figure out some sort of way of incorporating this that has limitations, so that David can't be like overusing this to get out of just like any problem, but at the same time, like, portrays this sense that David is this person who is trusting in God and seeking God's guidance, and has some sort of access to God, which I think we do have to tie in the fact that this is tied to the ephod, which we were talking about before, Chad, because the Urim and Thummim were in the ephod of the priests, and so one of the reasons why, so there's the sequence of Saul goes and he kills the priests of Nob, but there's one priest who escapes, Abiathar. He flees, he finds David, and he brings the ephod with him. And that's when we see David start to inquire of God, because he has the ephod, he has the Urim and Thummim with him. So I do think that we have to find some sort of way of incorporating that into the story, but we don't necessarily have to show explicitly all the mechanics of what's going on. Chad, what were you going to say?
I mean, I know I made the Austin Powers suggestion, but my inclination, I think, what would be the harm in going with one of the realistic possibilities, as far as what they might have looked like or been, and then like how, like, you could basically just go with one of those options and then using the mechanics that that some scholars suggest is like possible. And I mean, first of all, what do you think of that? Just straight up showing them.
I think one way in is we've got people's understanding of what the Ark of the Covenant is. I think these items are on that kind of a level of, there's, God has put power into an object of some kind, that it's not something that everybody has access to. It's just, just for the certain people. I think if we kind of treat it like the Ark of the Covenant, and that level of artifact, that I think that would be easily understandable to the average audience member, and easy enough to, kind of explain, like, well, we don't know exactly how it works, but this is what it does. And this is why it's not weird, because, hey, about the Ark of the Covenant. Well, this is like that. It's another one of those things that they have that has special connection with God for the people.
So let me cast like one way of understanding or depicting how the Urim and Thummim works. And this, one of the challenges of this approach that I'm going to suggest is that, as far as like how the book of Samuel is written, there are points where the book of Samuel, it'll give like dialogue from God. Yeah, so God will say, "Go save Keilah." So it doesn't say like, David flipped the Urim and Thummim and it landed on
Snake eyes.
this. It acts as if God is giving direct dialogue, but I think that'll be difficult to depict. So what I would lean towards the casting lots approach, which we don't necessarily need to see it, but in my mind, that would potentially be a good approach because it's more limited. So it like prevents you from like being able to, or like, David's not like hearing God, like talking to him like 24/7. Like we have a clearer sense of like, David's basically having to ask like yes or no questions or like either or questions. So the scholars who think of the Urim and Thummim as casting lots, a lot of one of the conceptions of this is that Urim actually comes from the word for, one potential etymology for it is that it's from the word for cursed, and Thummim is the word for perfection or blameless. So it's like cursed or blameless. So it's like primarily a judicial tool for deciding if someone is guilty or innocent. So you would use the Urim and Thummim to do that. And so if we did take that approach, and so like you see this show up like in the book of Joshua with Achan, they cast lots and eventually it comes down to Achan and his family. And then even in the book of Samuel, it shows up a couple times when Jonathan has honey during that battle earlier on in the book, and people are trying to figure out why there's a curse or whatever, and they realize that Jonathan broke the oath of Saul by doing that. James, I see you commented. Let me get my idea out, and then I'll look at your thought more. Okay. Anyway, so one way that you could do it is basically in the parts where in the book of Samuel, it looks like God is giving like direct dialogue. Instead of that direct dialogue coming straight from God, maybe there are like two different people who are offering like two different like pieces of advice, and David is trying to decide between the two, and he casts like the lot to like see like, do I go with this person or do I go with this person? Like which one is the kind of the blameless advice, and which one is the advice of that's like cursed or whatever. And so it could be in that sense like kind of limited to these kinds of like either or decisions, and maybe especially situations where David is having to judge between like in a difficult situation between like which way is the blameless path and which way is like the cursed path. So James is saying his idea is that you could cast lots, and the guy holding it speaks for God. Maybe Abiathar speaks for God. So yeah, that would be another possibility, is that you cast the lots, and then maybe Abiathar kind of gets a brief inspiration to say some sort of kind of additional commentary from God. But yeah, I don't know. Do you guys have any thoughts?
I just think the main thing you got to worry about is like, you don't want it to come across as something that, well, I've got a pair of dice at home. Can I just start rolling dice and asking God, and then base my life based on what I think was just said? I think there just needs to be a distinction that what David was doing is different and special than anything we might think that we could do for ourselves at the same time. Yeah. Magic 8-ball or tarot cards or whatever people want to use to predict their future.
Which I think you can emphasize that like Abiathar is bringing like this sacred object, like you're saying, like a Ark of the Covenant level like object that.
You could have people just coming up to him like, "Hey, why don't you go and cast some lots? We got a question." Like, "Oh, it doesn't work like that. It can't just." Yeah. It's just not all the time. So maybe some people might have in the show may have the wrong idea, and they can have it explained to them like, well, this is really how it works. It's just not willy-nilly using these things.
Chad, did you have thoughts?
I mean, part of what I get, this is the kind of puzzle I like to kind of like try and figure out, and I just have to step back and realize that, like, okay, this is something of like a mysterious element of like the biblical story. Like these, these stone things kind of show up and they're not fully explained, and they kind of disappear at points without being explained either. And that's part of it's like you either have to fill in the gaps, to eliminate some of those holes, and you just have to be okay with, that this isn't, we don't really know how it is, but this is, and we're not saying that this is how it was, but this is our way of handling it, or that's where it almost becomes appealing then to be like, maybe you just kind of don't have it in there, and I don't know. I'd be inclined to use it, but it's just going to be tricky because there are holes in the source material, and that's fine. But I guess it almost feels like fair game then to be like, fine, we're just going to have plot holes like in this, like we don't have to fully explain it. That doesn't feel good. It would feel better to just kind of come up with a kind of a system that kind of tries to make sense of it. And I don't have enough of a grasp on, I don't know. One of the questions I have is there this may be totally artificial and it may not be right, but are the stones, are they more used for kind of public inquiries versus private ones? Is there any basis with that, or is that something that you could just kind of make up? And because there are times where, I don't know. I also thought, I was trying to think of this too. I was trying to think of the scene with, this is different, but it reminded me of it. It was Jonathan. So when he defeats the Philistines, and how does that work? It's him and his armor bearer. And Jonathan just kind of like comes up with a way to be like, all right, if this is what we see, then here's what we're going to do. And it's, this is the Lord communicating to us. But if this is what happens, then the Lord's communicating this to us. And it seems, again, I can't remember, wish I could read it more closely here, but he wins. And it says, so the Lord saved Israel that day. And there's no, there's no stones there. And we're not even, he's not a priest or anything. I don't know, that just feels like a similar type of happening of inquiring of the Lord that just feels like, how does this fit into the system?
Well, with that kind of thing, I just think, is there a way that we can apply that today? Is there a universality to it that it's like, oh, well, anytime you feel like it, say, hey, what do you want me to do, God? And then you get an answer, and then you go forward. Is that something that's applicable? And do we want to say anything like that? I think that's the concern I would have, is like, by anything that we show, is it saying that this is something that you can apply to yourself as a Christian in 2024? Is it that universal of a truism?
I have one other thing to throw in there, which feels like it almost ties into the next question a little bit, is there's also God's Spirit, and I don't know how that interacts with like these kind of tools of divination, I suppose. God, ones that God has provided and ordained, but is that I was reading something that was saying that, the last time that lots really, I think, show up is with the choosing of Matthias, which is in the New Testament, like pre-giving of the Spirit at Pentecost. And so it's like, is there, that I haven't thought about this enough, but it's like, is that why, we don't cast lots? Because if lots, the lots that God allows are these two stones, they are given not to manipulate God, but to, let me finish my thought. Sorry. They're given not to manipulate God, but to conform to God's, to help people conform to God's will. And that's what the Spirit, one of the things the Spirit does for us. And I don't know how exactly the Spirit functions. It's really important because The spirit is then lifted from Saul and then given to David, and then there's the evil spirit. So I don't know, how does that intersect here?
So I don't know if we are going to need to show like the spirit rushing upon, because that wouldn't necessarily, David's already kind of been anointed before our story begins. Saul's already lost the spirit. I doubt that we're going to go back in a flashback to when Saul like loses the spirit. I guess it's possible that we would see like a flashback to when he has like one of the moments where the spirit falls upon him and he starts like having a ecstatic like prophesying moment, because I think that's kind of while David's on the run, potentially before we would pick up with the story, potentially not. We'll have to figure that out. I think that often when the spirit is described during like Judges and then here in this material, it's primarily kind of talking about like empowerment to do like tasks. So like,
okay,
a supernatural like empowerment, and not as much of like a relational thing that Christians would think of, in terms of like having a relationship with God and seeking God. And I don't think that we want to overread like our own situation as Christians today back into the Old Testament context, with like the spirit and stuff like that. Going back to the lots and the Urim and Thummim and all of that, I think one thing that we could do potentially, and I don't have an exact like system in mind for this, but we could somehow construct a way where every time that the Urim and Thummim are used to inquire of God, like maybe it is like a very like weighty moment where like if David doesn't listen to God, like there are consequences or something like that, where David has to take on an oath, or like he there's some sort of like kind of cost to it, where he's only going to do this kind of in the most serious situations for the good of the Israelites. I don't know. That's one way that we could potentially kind of limit it, and also kind of convey like this isn't something. So I think by really centering the importance of kind of the artifact, the Urim and Thummim, and we could provide a little bit of context that they were made by Bezalel and Holiab when they constructed the ark, and they're one of the most precious treasures of Israel. Like like this is another thing where we can have our various warriors kind of discussing it amongst themselves, and maybe some of them do think that it's just the same as casting lots, and we might have warriors who cast lots as part of their kind of decision making process, and others are like pushing back and being like, this is a very holy thing. Like, I don't know. I think that this may be another situation where we can lean into the nature of our primary point of view characters and emphasize that, that their situation is different from ours, and that I don't know, just that we can
in this case, I think the story will tell us what we need to do when we get to that point. When that particular event is happening, it'll be like, well, we need something to, that only these things can provide that context for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Chad, do you have any other thoughts, or?
No, just more questions, but
yeah.
But this is the kind of thing where you just kind of have to make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
You can't, you can't wait for there to be certain about. There's just certain gaps in our information, and but yeah, it's a tricky thing to deal with because some of your very questions that you have right there, like, are just not answered in the text. Like, what are the limitations of these objects, and kind of have to come up with something.
Yeah.
So
I think what I would say going forward, based on what we've said so far, we may be able to avoid like directly depicting the moment. Like, we can have some sort of understanding that it may be some sort of sacred lot casting, but we don't need to see, exactly what the rocks look like. David and Abiathar could potentially kind of like go off into, some sort of space, and the men kind of watch them go. And potentially, like, anytime that is happening, it's a very like momentous decision. It's a personal, like, should I, should I wear green socks today or blue socks? That's a silly kind of thing, because I doubt that they wore socks exactly like us today. But you guys get.
Feel like this is almost like it's a last resort sort of level that it rises to.
Yeah, and potentially, that we can maybe think more spontaneously. I don't have a good sense of like what would be a good maybe like cost to impose on using it, but we could try to come up with some sort of mechanism where David is going to be hesitant to do it because it comes at a cost. Maybe it's a sacrifice, or maybe it's some sort of obligation that he has to lay on himself, or maybe it like imposes almost like a physical or a spiritual cost, like on him or on Abiathar. So we can maybe
could it? I'm trying to think. Could it just be that you're kind of bound to whatever God says?
I like that.
Like the example of Ka'ila, and it doesn't say that it's the casting of stones, but it easily could be adapted to be like that, and it's not a small thing that to go into battle. I'm trying to remember if they're in kind of a precarious position or not going into this one, but it could just be that sense of being bound to the outcome. And just it's the idea of do we go into battle or not?
Like, you're taking the decision out of your own hands, which means that you no longer get to make a calculated decision based on the the costs and benefits that you're analyzing in the moment. Once God has like spoken on the matter, like, you have to go follow through and obey what he's going to say. Otherwise, there's going to potentially be cursing or some sort of negative consequence for the group or whatever. I think that is definitely a good like potential direction to go with it. And so, like, in these moments when David is doing it, he's having to like sacrifice that sense of like freedom and like self-direction, which is thematically on point. Like, he's turning away from the Saul thing, which is to kind of hold on to that the option to be able to direct things himself and not have to submit or be subject to the decisions of someone else. So it's kind of a sense of self-limitation, as opposed to like seeing it primarily as like a tool or like a I'm getting the cheat codes. It's like you're forcing yourself then to submit to God's decision in this situation.
Well, that's kind of David's whole thing. That's his deal, is that he had all these incredible things happen to him, and almost all of them were like opposite of what you would have thought. Little kid going up against a giant. People. He was out in the desert when everyone else was telling him, just go and take over. Just go and get him. Go get Saul. He showed time and again that he would trust God, and that's his biggest strength that he has. And that was his biggest failing, is that he went off and did his own thing on his own. So I think if you just kind of stick with that it's like he's using these items, but it's based on his strong, almost unwavering faith. That's why he's able to trust the results of them rather than just anybody just throwing lots.
Good. Cool. Well, I feel pretty good there with that as a direction for the inquiring of God then.
Although I feel kind of dumb for now saying the Kyla one, just looking at it. It's actually like right after David inquires of the Lord that Abiathar comes down with the ephod, and so I think that's where, just chronologically, it didn't make sense actually what I suggested, but anyways.
Okay, so moving on to Saul and the spirit that torments him. Initially, I have on here as I describe it as an evil spirit, but actually, if you look at the Hebrew, the spirit's described as Ra, and Ra potentially can mean evil, like morally evil, which is what we would think of, but it could also have the sense of like disastrous, harmful, destructive. So we could understand it either as literally an evil spirit, although we are told that it comes from Yahweh, or we could understand it as some sort of destructive or harmful spirit, which may actually be aligned with Yahweh because it's coming from him. It's potentially his servant. So yeah, as far as as we're thinking about it, we can think about, do we want it to be evil or just destructive? And then how would we, I think that it'll probably come up, even though we're not back during the period when David first was getting attacked by Saul. We might get flashbacks to that point, and I'm guessing that we're going to assume that Saul is kind of continuing to struggle with the spirit that is described while David is there. And we've discussed how we probably want to have some storylines that are based in Saul's court, even though our primary story is with David and the Outlaws. And so, we'll want to think through how we depict that spirit's influence on Saul. So it could potentially be visible, we could potentially get in Saul's head during some scenes, and we see some sort of visible being, whether it looks like a human or like a ghostly kind of thing. Another way that you could do it, if you're again getting inside Saul's head, is that he has some sort of distorted perception where he sees someone who is actually his son Jonathan, but he sees that the spirit is somehow able to make Jonathan look like an enemy or look like a monster or something, and so that's why he. So the reason I mentioned that is because there are these times where we're told how Saul is afflicted by the spirit, and he grabs a spear and throws it at David. So there's this sense that the spirit is somehow influencing him towards violence. Or we don't necessarily need to get into Saul's head, especially if he's not going to be one of our point of view characters. And so we could see it from the outside, and we could not really know how exactly the spirit is working on him. So it could be kind of ambiguous. It could even be, readers or viewers could even be open to the the interpretation that Saul is just like insane or bipolar or something like that. Yeah. What thoughts do you guys have?
I mean, I like that angle of it. I think depending on who our POV character is in Saul's court, if they're not going to be somebody that would be there with him, then they can hear about this or just see him. Saul. I don't. Would Saul come back and tell people about this? What he saw? That could be a way that all of that stuff that happened to him. How does he transmit that to other people? And then those people can judge whether or not that's crazy or how much of that actually happened. But for Saul, he believed it was real to him. So I think as long as he's talking to other characters, then he can present it exactly the way the Bible presents it without us having to try to explain it in a real world term.
Yeah. James is pointing out that he thinks there's a good argument that the spirit is actually like morally evil, because if you look at like kind of the effects that it has on Saul, he ends up following his worst instincts after he gets afflicted. So he starts hurling spears, and he murders the priest at Nob, and he's like even attacking his own son. Yeah, Chad.
So we've talked about like spear and sword kind of being a kind of image, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking about like if there's thinking of the ambiguous or insanity, like are there certain cues that we can give like the viewer that kind of, I'm trying to think of like a creative way to depict it that involve like imagery or certain symbols, or I also think like the role that like a score might play, like a certain theme that plays, and then that could be connected to, I don't know. Anyways, those are other like tools at our disposal to kind of, I don't know, and maybe that would be too subtle, but yeah, I guess that kind of goes with the last option of like if it is a little more ambiguous or insanity, that there would be other cues to show that like something evil is going on, especially if like maybe there is no connection between like the evil spirit here and the evil of the Philistines, I guess. But like if we wanted to make that connection, like you have the sword and the spear as like a common image, and you could have a common like musical kind of theme underplaying certain scenes where they show up, and trying to draw those connections. If I don't know if that's too much,
the evil theme,
dots,
that like whenever we hear it playing underneath, we know that okay, that's something that's on a slightly more actual level as opposed to just him thinking about it. Or it's like we hear the theme, we know that that's supposed to be implying there's something spiritual going on behind the scenes, even if we're not going to explain it fully. That would be a good way to cue that.
Yeah, I definitely think that that's a good it's a good point, just that we are doing an adaptation that's multimodal. So music is a really effective cue that we have in our arsenal to be able to hint at things like this. So yeah, I think some sort of like dark spiritual theme, which could also then come up when Saul has the encounter with the witch at Endor. And there might be other situations where that we invent, or that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head. Maybe while they're in Philistine territory, things like where they're encountering Philistine gods and stuff like that, where it'd be helpful to have kind of this dark spiritual power theme. We could even, there are probably other smaller ways to hint at it too, like maybe like the lighting, having kind of like different lighting, or I don't know if exactly this, but I'm thinking of like in horror films, like one trope or shooting technique that shows up as doing like a Dutch angle to make us feel kind of like off kilter. So some of those like kind of more like subtle movie magic tools might be a useful way to hint at the idea that Saul is being influenced by something, and then in the acting, like Saul just kind of coming across as like very changed in his demeanor, more violent, less reasonable, things like that.
It could also be like, this is another little trick. It's just like different eye color. Like he just has yellow eyes or like yellow irises. Like that's a little cheesy, but like you can do things like that. Like that says a lot without really saying anything. And so I'll throw in one other one. If, there is, I don't know this scholarly work, but there's some work that explores like serpentine or just snake imagery in Samuel. Like, obviously the snake is a really rich symbol in the Bible. And as a, even if you're putting it in places where, like in scenes where it's not, like it's still, if something in the scene is, connected to that symbol, namely just evil, I think you can rightly put it in there. And so there are all sorts of ways to put snake imagery in there that might be.
A cup could look like it has snakes carved into it, or
sure. Or there could be a snake carved into the spear, or some, or he might be hallucinating, that the spear is a snake and throws it, and things like that. I don't know which way you'd want to go with it, but you could.
Also tying it into your idea of with the music, you could almost have like subtle hints at snake, kind of like a rattle in the music for the evil, where it's like hinting at this idea of like, or that's a bad impression, but you guys get kind of what I'm going for there. While we're talking about music, it might even be interesting to have, we're told earlier on that one of the first ways that David interacted with Saul was as like they bring him in to play music for Saul when he would have these spiritual fits or whatever. And it might be kind of interesting and or funny to have like someone else who's like been brought in to like take over for David, but he just like isn't able to do it. And actually it could potentially be, if we do want to go with the idea of like Jonathan's servant boy being one of our point of view characters in the court of Saul, he could also like be that person. Like maybe he, mostly he's with Jonathan, but then they pull him in to play the harp for Saul, but it doesn't work for him like it did for David or something. That's just like
let's him be a fly on the wall. He's somebody there while other people are having way more important conversations. He's just there to play music.
And it may also be an interesting way to, if we are wanting to paint that character as kind of like in some ways like following in the footsteps of David, we could try to have like little parallels like that between their journeys. So just like David got to do this, like that character gets to do the whole harp and singing to Saul thing. But it's also a way to show how Saul is like degraded, because maybe it's not because this boy isn't doing a good job playing his harp. Like maybe it's just that Saul is like that much more down the dark path that, no harp playing, no singing can really do much good for him at this point.
I mean, while we're, getting our ideas from Austin Powers, I mean, if we can blow our budget on getting Mike Myers, we can have Saul's Dr. Evil spirit. No, maybe not.
We'll come back to that.
Okay.
I like where you're going. I like where you're going, but maybe we'll come back to that.
A frickin' spear. I don't know. Doesn't he say frickin' laser? Anyways. This is, we're getting to the bottom of the barrel here. So
yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. Anything else on the evil spirit while we're here?
I just think on both of them, I think we opt to try to incorporate them in creative ways. I think that's I'm okay. I started off thinking we shouldn't have it in it, but now I think there's definitely ways that we can do it and should do it.
Okay. Cool.
Mhm.
Well, I think this last section, I've got a few questions here, but I don't think that we may not get to all of them, but we can just hit on a couple and then call it quits. So one kind of bigger picture question is, why are the Israelites and Philistines at war? Because in the Bible, all the time, we know that the Philistines and the Israelites are at war, but we rarely are told why that is. There's not a whole lot of description of like the actual kind of like motivations or the things that are driving the conflict. So do you guys have any thoughts on how we should depict that? I'll be honest, I didn't try to do like a ton of like background research here. So yeah.
Like at what point in this David's part of the conflict are we coming in on this? What's happening at the exact moment that would probably start? Is he like working for them at this point, or are we going to show that actually take place?
Okay, so yeah,
deal with them?
that's a good. Let me do kind of a recap. So as far as kind of the where things are at with the Israelites and Philistines, so Philistines, they start showing up in kind of Judges. They're one of the peoples that the Israelites are called to push out of the land during the conquest, but the Israelites have a hard time doing it. And so Samson, he's one of the first judges to take on the Philistines. He makes a lot of victories, but the Philistines remain kind of a dominant power, and their borders with Israel are kind of blurry because the Philistines, when we show up in Samuel, the Philistines are really kind of one of the more dominant powers, and so at the beginning of Samuel, there's a big loss to the Philistines, and the Philistines are really kind of owning the Israelites in their conflict. When Samuel finally comes into power, he pushes them back a little bit, so things are looking better. But when Saul takes over, one of the big motivations for the people wanting the king is so that Saul will actually be able to push back more on the Philistines and lead them into victory. But he actually doesn't make very much progress at all during his years of kingship. It's not until Jonathan has his like big heroic victory that there's any progress at all. And then there's the David and Goliath story. David beats Goliath. That's a big victory. And then David starts getting lots of victories once he starts leading the armies of Israel out against the Philistines. So David is known for conquering many Philistines. And then he goes on the run. He makes one initial attempt to join the Philistines, and then he realizes that they are not going to be okay with him because he has killed a lot of their people. So he pretends to be insane, and then he leaves. And that's kind of when our story picks up, is after he's left there and he's gone off into the wilderness. So maybe we'll want to flash back to that point, but I don't know if we'll start there. And then probably in if we do 2 seasons, season 2 will probably pick up when David goes back to the Philistines and he finally aligns with them, and he's kind of doing like the double agent thing. So that's a quick overview. So as far as kind of the situation, I guess another important thing to put out there, we're told that at least during earlier on, like when Jonathan has the big victory against the Philistines. The Philistines are basically preventing the Israelites from developing technology. So Saul and Jonathan are like the only two people who have swords in Israel, because the Philistines won't allow blacksmiths to operate in Israel. So they're like a pretty powerful force, even during when Saul is supposedly king. Like they're exerting quite a bit of influence on the Israelites. But there is this sense, like I think, David's victory, that's supposed to be a big turning point. So definitely, like, the Israelites are a powerful force, and I would probably want us to show that, like, they are, they probably see the break between Saul and David as like an opportunity for them to be able to gain back some of the territory that they've lost as a result of David's victories. Because now that David is split from Saul, they're probably going to capitalize on that. And so we do get there's at least one story during this initial period of our story where the Philistines invade the Israelite borders, and David actually, that's one of the points where David inquires from God. He asks God, like, should I go confront the Philistines, even though it might mean that Saul will catch me doing that. And God tells him to go and confront them, even though it puts him on, like, potentially on a confrontation course with Saul. So yeah, is that helpful? Do you guys, I don't know, does that stir any thoughts for you guys?
How much of Israel's success or lack of success during this stretch parallels Saul's rise and fall and failings? That might be a way to tie those two things together, to where, there's all these kind of conflicts happening that aren't officially resolved until a lot later, at least not resolved enough. But we know eventually it's going to turn into a more unified kingdom for Israel, but it's still kind of chaotic at this point. So it could tie directly to Saul's kind of state of mind, where as he goes, so goes the battles, that the individual battles being fought.
Yeah, that's a good point, because one other kind of important point of the story is what's going to happen at the end of our story, which is Saul's going to get killed in a big battle against the Philistines, right? So we probably want to show leading to that like things are kind of like falling apart for Saul, and like you're saying, Victor, that could be tied in part to kind of his mental state. Also, it could be tied to one of his big commanders, David, and David's like battle ready men being away. So yeah, kind of this sense of like things are deteriorating. I definitely think that's something we would want to get at. Yeah, Chad.
I'm not sure I'm going to know how to articulate this. For the Philistines, how they function in the story or the adaptation, like, are they just kind of incidental? Like, they're just a force that's out there that forces our characters to make good or bad decisions, or are they going to embody or symbolize, it comes to one of our main themes, like as one of the nations, this is how not to be. Does that kind of make sense what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I'm guessing if we do end up doing a 2-season split, so like first season is David and his men on the run primarily in the wilderness from Saul, and then second season is after David and his men flee and join the Philistines and are kind of up in Philistine territory. I imagine that we would get a lot more of the Philistines in that second season, where David's interacting with them. He becomes the bodyguard of one of the Philistine lords or whatever. Whereas in the first season, they are still a force. So we don't want to completely forget about them, but they may not have as much of a significance from like a thematic standpoint.
Because
they may go.
I mean, thematically, I mean, they, you know, like Goliath kind of stands in as like the, I don't know, just kind of a picture of trusting in might, you know, and that's the Philistine way. Then you really like, they're really like one big kind of character that, I don't know, does that make sense? But you could also
they're
just
the
kind of make
Empire.
them a baddie, you know, that's just like forces our characters again to make good or bad decisions in response to them. But I'm kind of more inclined to think, yeah, the bigger picture is that they, kind of represent a way of going about being a nation, and that like Israel in their worst moments they want to be like them. And that's, I think that what prompts them to ask for a king is this crisis related to the Philistines. If I'm getting that right. Sorry, go ahead, Vic, if you had a thought.
No, I was just thinking that's kind of exactly, they're the empire to Israel's, you know, republic, you know. They're the ones that everyone, and even if you're only kind of familiar with biblical stories, you know that Goliath was a Philistine. I mean, I think that's kind of common for anyone, a baseline knowledge, and they know that the Philistines were the bad guys. Goliath was Darth Vader. He's like so I think you just start off with them, you just know that they're the not Israel. You know, they can represent everything that Israel isn't or should not aspire to be.
I think the comparison to the Empire, I'm guessing you're making a Star Wars reference there.
Trying to.
The Empire versus the Rebel Alliance is apt there. You know, with the Empire in Star Wars, we don't necessarily, especially in like the original trilogy, we're not necessarily like getting into their mindset. Like we don't need like a whole lot of like in-depth, like complex development of them, but just like visually, there's a lot.
They just want to conquer. That's all they want. That's all we need to know that they want.
Yeah, like, and that is kind of their thematic significance, is that they are this force that's about conquest. They're like highly technological. You know, they're highly trained. They're highly competent, and so that I actually think that's a lot of what we would want the Philistines to be. James is kind of pointing to that in the chat. He's saying that they're better technically. So like with their technology, they've got better tactics. They've got better morale. Like things are going better for them. And so we do want to embody that in how we portray them. And so it's not necessarily, especially in the first season, we may not get into the minds of a lot of Philistines. We may not be hearing about their philosophy or things like that, but we just can see this sense like through the way that, you know, their superior armor, their confidence, things like that. We can get this sense that these are guys who are really trusting, like you said, Chad, in the ways of this world, in strength, in physical stature, in military technology, in tactics, and things like that. And so that is like a important role that they play in the story.
I think also if we portray it to where all things being equal, they would easily defeat Israel. You know, it's only because we've got God on our side that they have a shot at winning. It's kind of make them technologically superior, you know, militarily superior. They should win. You know, that's any other situation they would be the winners. But you know, we've got Israel has something that they don't have.
Yeah. I do like an idea that James just added to the chat, which is that we have Saul try to improve the army at the cost of other things. And so like he could actually be trying to kind of like professionalize his army and make them more like the Philistines. And so that's one way in which we can show that Saul is being a king like the other nations. He's wanting to trust in, military discipline, in technology, and things like that. So that would be like an interesting little plot line to weave in, that Saul is actually trying to be more like the Philistines in order to defeat the Philistines, whereas David, as our kind of contrasting case, he's trusting in God. He's not trying to put together this unit with all the best technology and things like that. So that might be like an interesting way to incorporate the conflict.
Thematically, that fits everything.
Yeah. But as we're talking about it, I'm not sure if we necessarily need, especially in the first season, to have like a really strong sense of the strategic situation in Israel. Like, we don't need to know that's like, the Philistines are wanting to take over this outpost so that they can advance on this area so that they can get the grain or something like that.
I don't think we need any of that.
Yeah. We just
It's
need
like
to
we didn't need to know
that,
what the orc strategy was in Lord of the Rings. They just want to win.
Yeah.
That's actually what makes Star Wars like made it boring to me when I watch it. It's just like too much like talk of political plans or whatever. Am I wrong in that? That's my impression from watching
especially
them as a kid.
Especially
Right.
the prequels.
Yeah. Oh, that's probably
Exactly.
those are the ones I saw in theaters as a kid. So yeah. Anyways. Sorry, I had to throw in some Star Wars shade.
Don't get me started.
No, we won't have to get into any of the recent stuff, and we won't go there. Cool. Well, I think that answers a lot of our questions, because we didn't go through each of these questions, but I think we mostly got the sense of them. We didn't touch on specific factions in Israel, but I guess kind of what I'm thinking there is like, there's going to be Saul and like kind of his men, like they're one faction. David and his men, they're clearly a faction. There will probably also be like the priests, which then get slaughtered. But like, they're probably going to be, and then different like tribes, because Israel at this point is still very like tribal. There's lots of people who, even though Saul is the king of the land, we're not in like a kingship. Like
it's like 12 individual little states almost.
Yeah. And even that, like even at that level, it's probably like looser. Probably the most power is at the local level, and then like gradually less power as you move out. So like, I guess maybe just for us to keep in mind that Israel at this time isn't like this unitary thing. And so there's probably going to be some back and forth as far as, some tribes being more closely aligned with Saul. Some of them have like weakening ties, especially as the situation with the Philistines unfolds. Some of them may be mad at Saul for not doing more. Some of them may be frustrated. If I like, again, James's idea about Saul like trying to professionalize, but that could get pushed back from some tribes. There could be some that are more sympathetic to David, some that are less so. So we can just kind of like have that on our mind as we're going through the story. Do you guys have any other kind of thoughts on tribal stuff or factions in Israel?
No, I think that's an efficient way of just kind of showing that, there wasn't a unified region at this point. That they were made up of all these different little groups, and that does have a major factor over the long haul too.
Yep. And that kind of loops back to where we started this with the polygamy. Like one of the effects of us showing that David has multiple wives is that's like a way for us to communicate this idea that part of him being a king is him kind of trying to work with the different factions and build alliances within kind of these loosely tied networks of of tribes. So,
And I don't know the makeup of his merry men, but you could have the different tribal alliances that the different individual characters have that can kind of play into it, or at least can be reflected or verbalized through the different people to him, what the different factions are, kind of like a shorthand.
Yeah, I like that. And even tensions. Yeah, Chad.
How did you answer the question, the second one, who has the momentum at this point in the war?
I think that what I was thinking is that Saul is probably losing some momentum as a result of the loss of David and his men, but maybe he is trying to regain momentum, through like efforts to improve his military. Like,
I like that.
Maybe trying to bring in, like, get more technology, more swords, more training or something. That's generally kind of what I was thinking.
That works really good, I think.
So do we feel like, is the Philistine threat just like a cloud looming over like our, David and his band, like in addition to Saul? Like, is that fair to say? Like, is it?
They definitely, like, so with the instance of Keilah, they feel compelled to go there themselves to solve the situation. Like they apparently don't think that Saul will be able to go and handle it himself. Like they feel like we need to be the ones that go, or God feels that way, and tells them to go. So yeah, there is this sense of like a double threat. Like they're on the run from Saul, but they're also worried about how Israel itself is facing this larger threat, and Saul is so distracted by them, and also like misguided in his approach. So there is kind of that secondary antagonistic force.
I guess I was thinking of something like, I'm reading Harry Potter with my kids, and it's like we're in the 4th book, so there's like the resurgence of the Death Eaters, Voldemort's followers, or sorry, who must not be named. It's kind of this background kind of threat that's always there and that comes to the fore at different points when things happen. But otherwise, like Harry's worried about, Draco Malfoy and the Triwizard Tournament and things like that.
Well, I mean, if not for the Philistines, David wouldn't have to have all these 600 men assembled. They're the constant threat that's going to be there, that if they win, then Israel's done. I mean, I think that's
kind of what I mean by like,
threat.
Is it like a pretty like thick cloud, like dense cloud over them? That's like they're kind of, I don't know, as opposed to just like,
so.
Oh, like we're not doing something with Saul today. Like there's something with the Philistines, and like, does that make sense? And then if they are like this existential kind of threat, and if they also kind of embody like something of an evil kind of spirit, or character, like, does that make sense? Like, does that seem fair, or is that just like over dramatizing the role of the Philistines?
No, so like I think as you're saying that, that's making me think of when David finally decides to go join with the Philistines. We want that to be like a really big and surprising decision, for it to feel like
ending.
Yeah. So definitely, like, we want them to the Philistines to feel like a significant threat, maybe not as pressing as Saul, in the sense that we don't get the sense that the Philistines are searching out for David. Like that's not within the book of Samuel, at least. So the Philistines are more of a threat to Israel itself, whereas like Saul is more the one who's like out for them in particular. So Saul is the more existential threat for them, but David and his men are, they're not just out for their own skins. Like they're trying to do what's best for Israel itself. And so I think it'll present like some good situations where David and his men are having to decide between, like, do we do the thing that is smart for like our own survival, which is like focus on, keeping out of the limelight, avoiding Saul, just, keeping a low profile, or do we do like the good thing for the greater, for the nation of Israel? Like, do we fight the fight against the Philistines, even though it means that, potentially like, we'll put ourselves on the path of Saul. He'll see where we are. We'll be weakened, we'll make ourselves a target. So I think that'll, does that kind of speak to kind of what you're thinking of, Chad? Like, so the Philistines aren't like this pressing threat, but they create kind of difficult decisions for David and his men to have to navigate.
Yeah, that just kind of makes, and maybe that is the right, maybe that is the function or the role that they play in Samuel. That's, I think, what James is, it sounds like he's kind of saying, which makes me think that like maybe they're just more, I don't know. Yeah, they're I don't know if incidental is the right word, but they just function as like, opportunities for David and Saul to make decisions. And yeah, I don't know, maybe it's, I don't know.
Well, I mean, this allows for there to be 2 or 3 over the course of a couple seasons, big battles that are important, that are, are consequential. So I mean, they're always there. I mean, everything that both sides are doing is in response to whatever the Philistines are doing. So they're there no matter what, even if they're not a military battle threat at every single moment.
Yeah, maybe we should. I think maybe once we actually start plotting out, like putting together kind of a rough outline, that may give us a better sense of the role that the Philistines are going to play within the story. Like, do we want to have the sense that like defeating the Philistines is like one of the goals of the story? I mean, I guess one thing to keep in mind is that if we do have like the death of Saul be one of the final events of the show that we're plotting out, we're not necessarily envisioning the defeat of the Philistines being kind of that final end point for the show. And so they definitely shouldn't come across as like, we don't want viewers to be thinking like, oh, the show is leading up to a big battle where David's going to defeat all the Philistines. They are kind of the secondary threat in that sense.
So yeah, I guess maybe that I'm going to use the same Harry Potter kind of comparison. Are the Philistines like the Voldemorts and the Death Eaters, or are they like Draco Malfoy and the Slytherins? Does that make sense?
I would say, yeah. It's difficult because like you could argue it either way, because in some ways, the battle between David and Saul is like an inner house battle. So you would think that he would be Draco Malfoy, but kind of the final conclusion of our story isn't the destruction of the Philistines. It's the destruction of Saul. It may just be that it's not a analogy that will work, that you can press too far. But
sorry, I was asking if thinking of the Philistines, are they like Death Eaters or are they like Slytherins? Does that make sense? And maybe the comparison just kind of fails, but part of me thinks that like we're talking about it sometimes like, yeah, they're like Slytherin. Sometimes Harry and Ron and Hermione, like they have other things that they're doing, but like sometimes they encounter Draco and like he's the occasion for them, to make certain good or bad decisions. But then I'm like, well, the Philistines also like thematically they represent. I don't know. Yeah, it's again the comparison probably falls apart, but they just seem to represent. When it comes to some of these big thematic questions, like they just it's the use of power and might, to rule and to conquer and I don't know. Anyways, sorry, I'm
I just think they represent, every kind of negative influence or negative force that would come between somebody and God. That's they're putting pressure on all these characters to have to make decisions to either trust God or trust themselves. And I don't know if there's any other forces that are going to be out there in our story that would be able to consistently and easily, be the shorthand for that besides the Philistines. Even if they're not always present, I think they're there. They're just looming, like you're saying. They're the threat that everyone's worried about.
Yeah. We don't need to kind of figure out like an exact analogy for them, but I think, Chad, what you're getting at, they are not, in terms of like our story structure, I think the Philistines are not the primary antagonist. Like they're not even though they are perhaps like the bigger picture antagonist for Israel in terms of the story that we're telling. There may be individual episodes where they are the antagonist, but they are more like, to use like another analogy, they're more like Jabba the Hutt, as opposed to like the Emperor or whatever. So they're not like even though they are a very important counterpoint to what Israel is in terms of the story that we're telling. Saul is kind of our primary like opposing faction.
So I mean, it might be getting too late to like tell me if this is actually a appropriate enough analogy, but like the New Testament, that you have the empire kind of Rome really like impinging upon the people of God, and they and yet like the main opposition that's focused on is not Jesus and the emperor, but Jesus and the Jewish establishment, I guess. Is that?
Yeah, actually, I think that's a really good analogy. And I actually imagine there may be like some hints of maybe not exactly parallels, but like, yeah, I think the general analogy there is appropriate. Yeah. Cool. Well, I think we're at a pretty good stopping point here. We got through some real interesting material, some big challenges. So looking ahead, we'll get to talk about frame narrative, and maybe we'll also be able to do some kind of initial discussions of things related to the plot. But as we talked about, as Chad, you and Victor and I were talking about in an offline discussion, we're going to skip 3 weeks from now for our next episode. We don't want to record the week of July 4th. So we'll pick up 3 weeks from now. And then from that point, we'll go back to doing every 2 weeks. So yeah, thanks, James, again for your comments. And yeah, thanks again, Chad and Victor, for your continued presence. This has been a lot of fun. And yeah, again, anyone who's listening, please feel free to leave comments below the video or email me at thebibleartist@gmail.com. Would love to be incorporating other people's ideas and for this to be like a communal project that involves people beyond just those of us that are on the screen here. And, like, subscribe, all that fun stuff too. But that's it for now. Thanks everybody for listening, and Godspeed.
Good night.